September 18th, 2011, 6 p.m. The glass doors of the Borders Superstore in Ann Arbor locked for the final time. A handwritten sign reading, "Everything must go, store closed," hung in the window. The once bustling intellectual hub was reduced to empty metal shelves and stripped fixtures. What empire had just fallen? At its height, Borders wasn't just a bookstore, it was an American institution. With over 1,200 locations worldwide, it dominated the retail landscape, raking in billions in revenue. It was a cultural sanctuary where millions of customers spent their weekends sinking into plush armchairs, sipping coffee, and getting lost in endless aisles of literature and music. It defined the modern superstore experience. Yet just a decade later, the sanctuary was desecrated. The plush chairs were sold for pennies. The coffee bars ran dry. 39,000 employees were handed pink slips and shown the door. A vibrant community space was replaced by the hollow echo of footsteps on bare linoleum floors. How does an invincible empire of knowledge collapse so rapidly? It wasn't just the unstoppable rise of Amazon, nor was it solely the invention of the e-reader. Behind the closed doors of the boardroom, a series of fatal miscalculations, outsourced futures, and a stubborn refusal to adapt systematically dismantled a beloved literary titan. One disastrous partnership sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1971 to 2011. The tragic vanishing of America's premier bookstore chain reveals the brutal reality of the retail world. In the ruthless march of digital evolution, nostalgia is never enough to save you. In the early 1970s, Ann Arbor, Michigan, was a quintessential American university town, a vibrant intersection of counterculture, academic rigor, and political activism. The air around the University of Michigan was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the constant hum of intellectual debate. It was a place where ideas mattered, and by extension, where books were considered essential currency. In this fertile cultural soil, in the autumn of 1971, brothers Tom and Louis Borders opened a modest 800-square-foot used bookshop. To the casual observer passing by on State Street, the original Borders bookshop did not look like the genesis of a global retail empire. It looked like any other independent bookstore of the era, slightly dusty, crammed with towering shelves and smelling of aging paper and binding glue. The brothers were deeply passionate about literature, but they were entering a business that was notoriously romanticized and fundamentally inefficient. Selling books in the pre-digital age was a chaotic endeavor, driven almost entirely by guesswork. Store owners ordered titles based on intuition, hoping that what they liked would also appeal to their customers. Inventory tracking was a nightmare of index cards, handwritten ledgers, and physical headcounts. When a book sold, there was no immediate notification that it needed to be reordered. Bestsellers routinely ran out of stock, while obscure titles collected dust on the top shelves for years, slowly eating into a store's razor-thin profit margins. It was a charming way to run a neighborhood shop, but it was a terrible way to run a scalable business. Louis Borders, however, possessed a mind that operated differently from the typical bohemian bookseller. While he loved the printed word, he was also studying mathematics and computer science. Where others saw the romantic clutter of a bookstore, Louis saw a profound data problem waiting to be solved. He recognized that a bookstore was, essentially, a massive data set of consumer preferences, and the traditional methods of managing it were hopelessly primitive. This realization led to the true foundation of the Borders empire. Not a specific type of shelving or a unique marketing gimmick, but an invisible, revolutionary piece of software. Louis developed a proprietary computer program called the Book Inventory System, BIS. Long before algorithms dictated the modern retail landscape, BIS was an absolute revelation. The system did more than just track what was sitting on the shelves. It meticulously recorded every single transaction, building a comprehensive database of localized purchasing habits. BIS could predict sales trends with startling accuracy. It knew that a specific branch of poetry would sell consistently in a college town in November, or that a niche gardening book would suddenly see a spike in a suburban neighborhood in early spring. It removed the guesswork from ordering, ensuring that the right books were on the right shelves at exactly the right time. More importantly, The book inventory system allowed Borders to offer a staggering selection. While a typical independent bookstore of the 1970s might carry 10,000 to 20,000 titles, the Borders system made it financially viable to manage an inventory of 50,000 to 70,000 titles without suffocating under the weight of unsold stock. They could stock the highly profitable blockbusters alongside the obscure academic texts, satisfying both the casual reader and the demanding scholar. This technological advantage created a completely new atmosphere within the store. Customers walking into Borders were stunned by the sheer depth and breadth of the catalog. It felt as though any book ever published could be found within its walls. Yet despite the cold, calculating computer system running the back end, the front-of-house experience remained warm and fiercely intellectual. The brothers hired knowledgeable staff, often university students and graduates, who could engage customers in deep conversations about literature. They had successfully married the soul of a passionate independent bookshop with the operational efficiency of a tech company. By the late 1970s, the Ann Arbor store was a local phenomenon, generating revenue far beyond the industry average. But Tom and Louie realized something far more profound. They had not just built a successful bookstore, they had engineered a retail machine. The book inventory system was highly scalable. If it could perfectly optimize one store in Michigan, it could optimize 10 stores or 100 stores anywhere in the country. The brothers began selling their inventory system as a service to other independent bookstores, quietly gathering even more data about national reading habits. The seed planted in Ann Arbor had outgrown its pod. The Borders brothers possessed a technological weapon that no other bookseller in America had, and the inevitable next step was to unleash it on the rest of the nation. The era of the cozy, disorganized corner bookshop was ending. The era of the megastore was about to begin. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the blueprint perfected in Michigan began to replicate across the American landscape. Armed with their unmatched book inventory system and fueled by an infusion of corporate capital following a strategic acquisition by Kmart Corporation in 1992, Borders embarked on an aggressive, calculated campaign of expansion. The retail paradigm was shifting. For decades, the American book market had been dominated by small, mall-based chains like B. Dalton and Walden Books, cramped, brightly lit spaces focused almost entirely on mass-market paperbacks and fleeting bestsellers. Borders sought to render that model entirely obsolete. Their goal was no longer just to sell books, it was to redefine the very concept of the American bookstore. They were building cathedrals of consumption. Walk into a Borders superstore in the mid-1990s, and the sensory shift was immediate and profound. These were sprawling, multi-level palaces, frequently occupying 30 to 40,000 square feet of prime real estate. The architectural design deliberately evoked a sense of grand intellectualism, often featuring dark wood paneling, deep green accents, and soft, warm lighting that contrasted sharply with the harsh fluorescent glare of traditional big-box retail. The aisles were wide and inviting. A standard mall bookstore might carry 15,000 titles, heavily weighted toward whatever was currently popular. A Borders superstore, powered by the invisible calculating engine of its proprietary inventory software, routinely carried upwards of 100,000 distinct titles. They created a profound illusion of infinite choice. And then there was the smell, a rich, intoxicating, and now nostalgic blend of freshly printed paper, binding glue, and roasted espresso beans. Borders was a pioneer in realizing that a modern bookstore needed to be a third place, a sanctuary outside of the home and the workplace where people could simply exist without the immediate pressure of a transaction. They stripped away the traditional retail urgency to buy and leave. Instead, they installed plush, oversized armchairs, deep leather sofas, and heavy oak tables in quiet, secluded corners. They integrated in-house cafes, frequently partnering with brands like Seattle's Best Coffee, actively encouraging customers to grab a latte, pull a towering stack of hardcovers off the shelves, and sit for hours. To the old guard of retail management, allowing the general public to treat brand new merchandise like library books seemed like a recipe for financial ruin through damage and theft. To Borders, it was a masterstroke of customer psychology. The longer people lingered in the store, the more comfortable and attached they became to the space. Eventually, that lingering translated into unparalleled loyalty and massive sales. The Superstore experience, however, extended far beyond the written word. Borders recognized early on that their core demographic, curious, educated, culturally engaged consumers, consumed media in multiple formats. Consequently, they transformed their vast locations into comprehensive entertainment hubs. Entire floors were dedicated to music and cinema, rivaling the inventory of dedicated record stores like Tower Records or Sam Goody. The CD sections were astonishingly vast, featuring towering racks that housed everything from mainstream pop and rock to obscure classical imports, world music, and niche jazz labels. Listening stations dotted the aisles, allowing teenagers, college students, and audiophiles alike to put on a pair of heavy headphones and sample the latest releases before committing to a purchase. It became a defining weekend ritual for a generation. Meet up at Borders on a Friday night, grab a coffee, browse the expansive magazine racks that carried international titles you couldn't find anywhere else, listen to a new album, and inevitably leave with a shopping bag full of items. Borders also became the beating heart of local communities through its aggressive calendar of events. The Superstores featured dedicated performance and presentation spaces. They hosted local folk musicians on Saturday afternoons, children's story hours on Sunday mornings, and massive line-around-the-block author signings in the evenings. When the Harry Potter phenomenon struck, Borders stores transformed into midnight festival grounds, filled with costumed children and adults counting down the seconds until the new release. It was a primary destination for first dates, a quiet refuge for students cramming for midterms, and a safe, engaging environment for families. Crucially, the human element within these massive spaces matched the depth of the inventory. Borders cultivated a fierce reputation for hiring genuine bibliophiles and music aficionados. In the golden era of the chain, applicants often had to pass a rigorous written test to prove their literary and musical knowledge before being hired. When a customer asked a staff member wearing a Borders lanyard for a recommendation, they weren't met with a blank stare or directed to an end cap display. They were engaged in a passionate, nuanced conversation. By the late 1990s, the Borders logo had become a ubiquitous symbol of suburban and urban sophistication across America. They anchored upscale shopping centers, revitalized historic downtown buildings, and expanded aggressively into international markets. The empire of pages seemed boundless and untouchable. They had successfully commodified the intellectual and cultural experience, packaging it within a highly efficient, aesthetically pleasing, and deeply beloved retail box. As the new millennium approached, Borders stood at the absolute zenith of physical retail, a titan seemingly impervious to disruption. The shelves were endlessly restocked, the cafes were buzzing with conversation, and the future appeared as bright as the polished wood of their reading tables. But outside those doors, a quiet digital revolution was brewing, one that Borders would severely, fatally underestimate. As the 1990s drew to a close, Borders Group was practically printing money. They were expanding at a breakneck pace, opening massive new superstores domestically and internationally. The executives sitting in the boardrooms in Ann Arbor looked out at a retail landscape they seemingly conquered. They had the best inventory system, the most sophisticated store designs, and an intensely loyal customer base. They were the undisputed kings of the physical retail world. But while their eyes were fixed firmly on conquering prime real estate and building more mahogany shelves, a quiet, invisible disruption was taking root in a garage in Bellevue, Washington. In 1994, a former Wall Street executive named Jeff Bezos launched an internet company called Amazon.com, branding it as Earth's biggest bookstore. At first, the traditional giants of the industry, both Borders and its primary rival, Barnes & Noble, viewed this digital upstart with a mixture of mild amusement and outright dismissal. The prevailing dogma within the Borders leadership was deeply rooted in the physical, sensory experience of their stores. They firmly believed that the core demographic of true book lovers would never abandon the joy of browsing physical aisles, smelling the paper, and sipping espresso in a leather chair just to click a button on a clunky dial-up internet browser. Books, they argued, were tangible, emotional purchases, not mere commodities to be shipped in brown cardboard boxes. Because of this deeply entrenched corporate hubris, Borders was agonizingly slow to respond to the dawn of e-commerce. It wasn't until 1998, a full 4 years after Amazon's launch, that Borders finally debuted its own website, Borders.com. However, the launch was less of a strategic offensive and more of a reluctant concession to a passing fad. The website was poorly funded, difficult to navigate, and operated entirely separately from the brilliant, highly efficient inventory system that powered their physical stores. It bled money almost immediately. The leadership, entirely composed of traditional brick-and-mortar retail veterans, viewed the website not as the future of the company, but as a frustrating distraction from their core business of building massive physical stores. By 2001, the dot-com bubble had burst, and the internet was viewed by many traditional retailers with renewed skepticism. Borders.com was continuing to lose millions of dollars a year. The executives faced a critical crossroads. They could either heavily invest in their digital infrastructure, take the short-term financial hit, and build a robust online platform to compete in the 21st century, or they could cut their losses and focus on what they knew best. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they made one of the most catastrophic corporate blunders in modern business history. In April 2001, Borders announced a strategic alliance that shocked the retail world. Instead of competing with the digital threat, they surrendered to it. Borders completely outsourced its online retail operations to Amazon. If a customer typed Borders.com into their web browser, they were seamlessly redirected to a co-branded site powered entirely by Amazon's interface, Amazon's inventory, and Amazon's fulfillment centers. At the time, Borders executives proudly touted the deal as a masterstroke of corporate synergy. They had successfully eliminated the heavy financial burden of running an e-commerce platform. They no longer had to worry about server maintenance, warehouse fulfillment for individual book orders, or digital customer service. They could sit back, collect a modest commission on every book sold through the co-branded site, and redirect all their capital back into aggressively opening more brick-and-mortar superstores. But what they failed to realize was the true currency of the digital age. Amazon wasn't just selling books. They were mining data. By handing over their website, Borders effectively handed the keys to their entire digital future to their most dangerous competitor. Every time a loyal Borders customer went online to buy a book, they were implicitly being trained by Borders to use Amazon. More disastrously, Amazon was collecting vital, granular data on those customers. Their names, their addresses, their reading habits, their credit card numbers, and their purchasing patterns. For 7 critical years from 2001 to 2008, Borders operated without a meaningful digital presence of its own. During the exact window of time when the internet transitioned from a novelty to the dominant force in global commerce, Borders essentially went offline. They voluntarily removed themselves from the digital learning curve. They did not build digital marketing teams. They did not develop independent e-commerce logistics. They built no infrastructure to understand the rapidly changing online consumer. They were essentially paying their biggest rival to steal their customer base. It was a Trojan horse, warmly welcomed into the gates of Ann Arbor. Amazon happily processed the orders, shipped the books, and quietly built an unassailable digital monopoly, subsidized in part by the very company it was destined to destroy. By the time Borders executives realized the colossal magnitude of their mistake, the landscape had fundamentally shifted. The physical expansion they had prioritized had left them saddled with expensive, long-term leases for massive stores that were slowly seeing declining foot traffic. The internet was no longer just a place to buy books. It was becoming the primary place where people discovered them. The invisible disruption was no longer invisible. It was a towering digital behemoth that cast a long, dark shadow over every physical bookstore in America. And Borders, having willingly disarmed itself at the dawn of the war, was entirely unprepared for the next devastating wave of technological evolution that was about to hit: the digitization of the book itself. By the mid-2000s, the physical world and the digital world were no longer separate entities. They were colliding. For Borders, this collision was catastrophic. While the company had finally ended its disastrous partnership with Amazon in 2008 to relaunch its own website, the move was a decade too late. They had no digital infrastructure, no customer data, and most importantly, no momentum. But even as they struggled to sell physical books online, a new threat emerged that questioned the very necessity of paper and ink. In November 2007, Amazon released the Kindle. It wasn't the first e-reader, but it was the first one that worked seamlessly. It was light, it could hold thousands of books, and it allowed users to purchase and download a new title in under 60 seconds. The Kindle surprise fundamentally altered the DNA of the publishing industry. Suddenly, the massive 30,000 square foot superstores that Borders had spent decades building began to look less like cultural sanctuaries and more like expensive, high-maintenance liabilities. Borders' primary rival, Barnes & Noble, saw the writing on the wall. They pivoted aggressively, investing hundreds of millions of dollars to develop their own e-reader, the Nook. It was a desperate, expensive gamble, but it gave Barnes & Noble a seat at the digital table. It kept their brand relevant in the eyes of the tech-savvy consumer. Borders, however, was paralyzed by a digital blind spot. The leadership team in Ann Arbor remained stubbornly wedded to the past. They viewed ebooks not as a transformative shift, but as a niche product for tech enthusiasts that would never replace the real experience of a physical book. When they finally realized that the ebook revolution was real, they found themselves in a familiar, losing position. They had no technology of their own. Instead of building a proprietary platform like the Kindle or the Nook, Borders once again looked for a shortcut. They partnered with Kobo, a Canadian digital bookstore, to sell Kobo e-readers in Borders stores. It was a repeat of the Amazon mistake. By selling a third-party device, Borders was once again directing their customers to an ecosystem they didn't own. They were providing the showroom floor for another company's product. Every Kobo e-reader sold in a Borders store was a customer who would likely never need to walk back into that store again. The internal atmosphere at Borders during this time was one of mounting anxiety. Employees in the stores, the bibliophiles and experts who were the face of the brand, watched as the new arrivals tables were slowly replaced by electronics kiosks that the staff weren't properly trained to sell. The identity of the store was fracturing. Was Borders a bookstore, an electronics shop, a cafe? In trying to catch up to a future they had ignored, they began to lose sight of the very things that had made them great in the first place. Chapter 4, The Digital Blind Spot, Part 2. The failure of the Kobo partnership was merely a symptom of a deeper, systemic rot within Borders' strategy. While they were fumbling with e-readers, the very layout of their stores was becoming a trap. Borders had invested heavily in CD and DVD sections, often occupying up to 20% or 30% of their floor space. In the 1990s, these were profit engines. In the late 2000s, with the rise of iTunes, Spotify, and Netflix, these sections became ghost towns within the stores. Row after row of plastic jewel cases sat untouched, gathering dust while the company continued to pay premium rent for the square footage they occupied. The massive inventory that was once a sign of strength had become a financial anchor, dragging the company down. While Amazon had no physical overhead and Barnes & Noble was downsizing their music sections to make room for toys, games, and the Nook, Borders remained frozen. The financial impact was devastating because Borders had spent so much capital on physical expansion and long-term leases in the early 2000s, they had no dry powder left to fund a digital transformation. They were caught in a classic innovator's dilemma. They were so protective of their existing, declining business model that they couldn't invest in the model that would eventually replace it. By 2009, the digital blind spot had become a total eclipse. The company's stock price was in freefall, and the trade credit that allowed them to keep books on the shelves was beginning to dry up. Publishers, sensing the looming shadow of a collapse, began to demand shorter payment terms. The shelves, once famously overstuffed with 100,000 titles, began to show gaps. The illusion of infinite choice was flickering out. Borders had failed to realize that in the 21st century, a bookstore's greatest competition wasn't another bookstore. It was the screen in the customer's pocket. By the time they tried to pivot, the digital gates had already closed, and Borders was left outside holding a paper map in a GPS world. To understand the fall of Borders, one must look past the warm glow of the reading lamps and into the cold, stark reality of the company's balance sheet. By the mid-2000s, Borders was no longer just a bookstore. It had become a house of debt, a fragile structure built on leveraged expansion and increasingly desperate financial engineering. The primary architect of this fragility was a fundamental misalignment between the company's physical footprint and its actual cash flow. In the 1990s, when Kmart spun Borders off into a separate public company, the move was celebrated. But it left Borders with a massive burden: the pressure of quarterly earnings reports. To satisfy Wall Street's insatiable demand for growth, Borders did the only thing it knew how to do. It built more. They signed hundreds of long-term expensive leases for massive superstores in prime suburban locations. These leases were ironclad contracts, often spanning 15 to 20 years. When the economy was booming, these stores were gold mines. But as foot traffic began to shift toward the internet, these same stores became anchors. Borders was locked into paying premium rent for 30,000 square feet of space, even as the music and DVD sections, which accounted for a massive chunk of their revenue, were being decimated by digital downloads. By 2007, the company was caught in a lethal pincer movement. On one side, revenue was stagnating or declining as Amazon and Barnes & Noble ate their market share. On the other side, fixed costs, rent, utilities, and labor for over 1,000 locations were rising. To bridge the gap, the company began to borrow heavily. They took on hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, not to innovate or build a digital platform, but simply to keep the lights on and satisfy the terms of their aggressive expansion from years prior. Then came the fatal blow, a series of disastrous stock buybacks. Between 2003 and 2007, in a misguided attempt to boost their flagging stock price and please shareholders, Borders spent over $500 million of its precious cash to buy back its own shares. It was financial suicide. They were burning their lifeboats to keep the engine running for a few more miles. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, that $500 million, which could have been a crucial war chest for digital transformation or a safety net during the credit crunch, was gone, vanished into a devalued stock price. The global financial crisis of 2008 turned a difficult situation into a terminal one. As the credit markets froze, the house of debt began to tremble. Borders' business model relied on a delicate cycle of trade credit. Essentially, publishers like Penguin Random House or Simon & Schuster would ship millions of dollars worth of books to Borders on credit, expecting to be paid months later from the sales. But as the headlines about Borders' mounting debt and declining sales grew louder, the publishers grew terrified. They looked at the balance sheet and saw a company that was technically insolvent. One by one, the major publishing houses began to tighten their grip. They demanded payment up front. They reduced the amount of credit they were willing to extend. This created a death spiral. Without credit, Borders couldn't stock the latest bestsellers. When customers walked in and saw empty spots on the new arrivals tables, they stopped coming. When foot traffic dropped, revenue dropped further, making it even harder for Borders to pay the publishers. The very thing that had made Borders great, the illusion of infinite choice, was being dismantled by its own creditors. Internal management was in a state of civil war. Because of the financial pressure, the board of directors engaged in a revolving door policy for leadership. They cycled through CEOs with background in finance, turnaround specialists, and retail veterans, each bringing a different fix that only added to the confusion. One CEO tried to turn the stores into lifestyle centers with more non-book gifts. Another tried to slash costs by firing experienced, high-paid staff, the very bibliophiles who were the soul of the brand. By the end of 2009, the numbers were staggering. Borders was carrying over $350 million in debt and reporting quarterly losses in the tens of millions. The interest payments alone were eating up whatever meager profits they could scrape together. They were no longer a bookstore chain that happened to have debt. They were a debt management firm that happened to sell books. The walls were closing in, and in the quiet aisles of the remaining stores, the staff could feel the end approaching. The house of debt was one small tremor away from a total, irreversible collapse. While the house of debt was crumbling, the command center in Ann Arbor was in a state of total disarray. If a company is a ship, then by 2005, Borders was a vessel caught in a Category 5 hurricane with a revolving door at the captain's wheel. In the final decade of its existence, Borders Group cycled through 5 different CEOs, each bringing a radically different and often conflicting vision for the company's survival. This lack of consistent leadership turned a difficult situation into a chaotic freefall. The tragedy of Borders' leadership was a classic case of ivory tower syndrome. The board of directors, increasingly panicked by falling stock prices, stopped looking for leaders who understood books and started looking for magicians who could fix spreadsheets. They brought in executives from the world of discount retail, finance, and even the grocery industry. These leaders arrived with impressive resumes, but possessed zero DNA for the unique intellectual culture that made Borders a beloved brand. One of the most devastating eras of this chaos occurred under the leadership of executives who viewed books as mere units of inventory rather than cultural artifacts. In an attempt to mimic the high turnover success of big box retailers like Target or Walmart, management began to slash the very things that defined the Borders experience. To optimize labor costs, they cut the hours of the most experienced staff, the experts who knew the difference between a first edition and a mass market reprint. They replaced these veterans with part-time, low-wage workers who, while hardworking, lacked the deep literary knowledge that customers expected. The intellectual sanctuary was being staffed by people who couldn't find the philosophy section without a computer. The confusion at the top manifested in the stores as a bizarre identity crisis. Under one leadership team, Borders tried to become a lifestyle destination, filling the front of the stores with overpriced paperweights, plush toys, and trendy kitchen gadgets. The logic was that these items had higher profit margins than books. However, it alienated the core customers who came to Borders for literature. A customer looking for a rare translation of Tolstoy would walk in only to be confronted by a wall of as seen on TV products and scented candles. Borders was losing its soul in a desperate bid to find a profit margin. Even more damaging was the internal civil war between the physical store divisions and the belated digital teams. Because the leadership changed so frequently, no one could commit to a long-term digital strategy. One CEO would authorize a multi-million-dollar investment in a new website, only for his successor to cancel it 6 months later to save costs. This indecision meant that while Amazon was perfecting the one-click purchase and Barnes & Noble was unifying its Nook ecosystem, Borders was stuck in a perpetual loop of starting over. By 2008, the leadership's primary focus had shifted from how do we grow to how do we survive another quarter. The board became obsessed with short-term fixes. They sold off profitable international subsidiaries in the UK, Australia, and Singapore just to raise quick cash to pay down domestic debt. They were selling the furniture to pay the heating bill. This era of chaos created a profound sense of corporate whiplash. Store managers would receive new directives every few months, one month focusing on loyalty programs, the next on aggressive discount end caps, the next on expanding the cafe. There was no North Star. The brilliant inventory system created by the Borders brothers decades ago was now being fed contradictory data by a leadership team that didn't understand the market. By the time the final CEO took the helm, the damage was localized in the very foundation of the brand. The trust between the corporate office and the store-level employees was broken. The trust between the brand and its customers was fading. Borders had become a giant, directionless ghost ship, drifting toward the rocks while its officers argued about the color of the lifeboats. By 2010, the atmosphere inside Borders stores across America had changed dramatically. The bustling, glamorous atmosphere of the once iconic cultural sanctuary had been replaced by an unsettling feeling. These were no longer distant predictions from Wall Street analysts. This was a reality unfolding on every bookshelf. The most obvious sign was the emptiness. Loyal customers began noticing unusual gaps on shelves that had once been overflowing with 100,000 titles. New arrivals, the lifeblood of any bookstore, were no longer arriving on time. The reason was devastating. The world's largest publishers, from Penguin to HarperCollins, had begun foreclosing. They refused to ship new books unless Borders paid in cash immediately. For an empire that relied heavily on credit, this was a slow, agonizing death sentence. Staff at the bookstores, those who have spent their youth advising on literature, now face the heartbreaking questions from customers. Why don't you have this book? Or, is the store closing soon? The management at the Ann Arbor bookstore tries to reassure with optimistic press releases, but on the ground, store managers are forced to take desperate measures to mask the decline. They stretch out the book aisles, turn book covers outwards to fill the gaps, or fill shelves with cheap storage items. Borders is trying to maintain the appearance of a giant, while its internal organs have begun to fail. In the final months of 2010, the financial crisis transformed into a humanitarian crisis at Borders. To cut costs to the maximum extent possible in order to pay off debts, the company implemented mass layoffs. 20-year-old book specialists were replaced by untrained temporary workers. Heating was cut, and maintenance services were canceled. The bookstores that had once been the pride of bustling suburbs were now gloomy and cold. December 2010, Borders' last Christmas season, was a retail tragedy. While competitors like Amazon recorded record sales of Kindle e-readers and Barnes & Noble attracted crowds with Nooks, Borders was empty. They lacked the funds to stock up for the holiday season. The Seattle's best coffee counters inside the bookstore began running out of supplies. Customers entered seeking a festive atmosphere, but found only sparsely stocked shelves and exhausted employees with anxious eyes. The final breaking point came in January 2011. Borders officially announced it would postpone millions of dollars in payments to suppliers and landlords to retain cash. This was the final warning to the world that the ship was sinking. Credit insurance companies immediately withdrew, leaving Borders completely isolated in the economy. At this point, the question was no longer, will Borders collapse? But when will it disappear completely? Hiring signs were replaced by whispered discussions about Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. An empire that had once changed the way the world read was now on the brink of collapse, awaiting the final blow from its creditors. The formal end began on February 16, 2011. Borders Group officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. For months, the company had desperately searched for a white knight, a private equity firm, or a strategic buyer like Barnes & Noble, to swoop in and save the brand. But as the accountants scrubbed the books, they found a wasteland of debt and obsolete inventory. No one was coming to the rescue. By July, the narrative shifted from reorganization to liquidation. The final chapter wasn't being written by authors or editors. It was being dictated by liquidators. The atmosphere in the remaining 399 superstores changed overnight. The Borders signs, once symbols of intellectual curiosity, were obscured by massive, garish, yellow and red banners screaming, "Going out of business," and "Everything must go." These weren't the classy, curated sales the customers were used to. This was a fire sale. The liquidation firms, Great American Group, Hilco Merchant Resources, and Gordon Brothers, took over the operations. They didn't care about the history of Ann Arbor or the third place philosophy. Their only goal was to squeeze every cent out of their remaining assets. For the 10,700 employees who remained, the final weeks were a descent into retail purgatory. These were people who had spent years organizing book clubs and recommending obscure poetry, now forced to spend their days tearing down the very shelves they once meticulously curated. The sophisticated book inventory system, the crown jewel of the Borders brothers, was reprogrammed for destruction. Instead of optimizing for sales, it was now calculating the daily percentage drops in price. 20% off, then 40%, then 70%. The stores themselves began to rot from the inside out. As the best sellers and popular items were snatched up by bargain hunters in the first few days, the deep, dark corners of the inventory were exposed. Obscure computer manuals from 1998, forgotten travel guides to countries that had changed their names, and thousands of unsold CDs that no one had a player for anymore were dragged into the light. The once pristine aisles became cluttered with discarded coffee cups and torn packaging. The sense of dignity that had defined Borders for 40 years evaporated in a matter of days. The final days of September 2011 felt like a funeral that lasted a month. Customers who had spent their childhoods in these aisles returned for one last look, but they were met with a heartbreaking sight. The plush armchairs where so many first dates had happened and so many exams had been studied for were tagged with price stickers. The heavy oak tables were sold for $50. Even the lanyards worn by the staff and the staff picks, shelf talkers, were discarded in the trash. In the final week, the silence in the stores was deafening. The music systems had been turned off. The cafes were ghost towns. The espresso machines already hauled away. Customers walked through the skeletons of the bookshelves, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum. It was no longer a bookstore. It was a warehouse of remnants. One former manager recalled the final hour of her store in California. She described the vultures, customers who waited until the very last hour to argue over a 90% discount on a damaged book. But she also remembered the regulars who came in just to say thank you. They brought cookies for the staff. They stood in the empty aisles and cried. For these people, Borders wasn't just a corporation. It was a part of their identity, a landmark of their town's intellectual life. On the final night, the ritual was the same across America. The last few items, often broken fixtures or stray greeting cards, were swept into the bin. The staff, many of whom had worked together for decades, gathered in the center of the empty floor. There were no speeches from the corporate office in Ann Arbor. There were no goodbye emails from the rotating door of CEOs. There was only the sound of the metal security gates being pulled down for the last time. As the lights flickered off, store by store, a massive cultural vacuum was created. 1 in 200 locations went dark. Millions of square feet of real estate became available. The signs were stripped from the buildings, leaving behind ghost signs, faded outlines of the Borders logo on the brickwork, a haunting reminder of an empire that thought it was too big to fail. The liquidation was complete. The books were gone, the people were gone, and the sanctuary was closed forever. The disappearance of Borders Group in 2011 didn't just leave a gap in the stock market. It left thousands of physical scars across the American landscape. Almost overnight, millions of square feet of prime retail real estate became hollow. These were not small storefronts that could be easily filled by a dry cleaner or a pizza parlor. These were massive, cavernous, big-box spaces, specifically designed with high ceilings and mezzanine levels to house the dreams of a bookstore empire. In the years following the liquidation, the ghost of Borders haunted suburban strip malls. Some locations remained vacant for years, their iconic neon signs removed to reveal the stained, unpainted brick underneath, a phenomenon urban explorers called retail shadows. Eventually, these spaces were carved up or taken over by businesses that reflected a new, less intellectual economy. Discount clothing retailers like TJ Maxx, fitness centers, or seasonal Halloween pop-up shops. The third place where people once gathered to discuss philosophy was now a place to buy discounted yoga pants or plastic skeletons. The intellectual property of Borders, the name, the brand, and the precious customer list, was auctioned off to its arch rival, Barnes & Noble, for a mere $13.9 million. It was a pittance for a brand that once generated billions. Barnes & Noble didn't want to revive the stores. They wanted the data. They redirected Borders.com to their own site, effectively absorbing the last remnants of their competitors' digital soul. However, the legacy of Borders lives on in the DNA of modern retail, serving as a permanent cautionary tale. Every MBA program in America now studies the Amazon Borders partnership as the gold standard of how not to handle digital disruption. The fall of Borders proved that a brand's heritage and the emotional connection of its customers are not armor against technological obsolescence. It taught the industry that outsourcing your core competency, your connection to the customer, is a form of slow-motion suicide. Ironically, the vacuum left by Borders didn't just benefit Amazon. In a strange twist of fate, the death of the corporate giant led to a modest revival of independent bookstores. Without a Borders in every town, local readers began to seek out small, curated shops that offered the human connection Borders had lost in its final years. But for the millions of Americans who grew up wandering the aisles of a Borders on a Friday night, no small shop could ever replicate the sheer, overwhelming scale of that empire of pages. Borders wasn't just a store, it was an era of American optimism, a belief that knowledge could be sold like a blockbuster movie, and that a bookstore could be the center of the world. The story of Borders Group is more than just a ledger of bad debts and failed digital strategies. It is a cautionary tale about the fragility of cultural institutions in the face of a ruthless technological tide. For 40 years, Borders wasn't just selling paper and ink. It was selling a sense of belonging, a quiet corner in a loud world, and the promise that knowledge was accessible to anyone with an afternoon to spare. Its collapse serves as a stark reminder that in the world of retail, the things we love are not always the things that survive. A brand can become a household name, a sanctuary for millions, and a pillar of the community, and still vanish if it forgets that the future doesn't wait for those who are comfortable. Borders fell because it believed its past success was a shield, failing to realize that by the time you see the wave of change, it is often too late to learn how to swim. When the last Borders sign was unbolted from its brickwork, a specific kind of American magic disappeared. The third place between work and home shifted from the leather armchairs of a bookstore to the cold blue light of a smartphone screen. We gained the convenience of a million books at our fingertips, but we lost the serendipity of the aisles, the chance encounter with a stranger in the philosophy section, the smell of the cafe, and the quiet dignity of a place dedicated entirely to the human mind. As we look at the empty shells of these former giants, we are left with a final, haunting lesson. Innovation is not just about technology, it is about protecting the soul of your business while the world changes around you. Borders lost its way, then its digital future, and finally its life. But for those who remember the midnight release parties and the rainy Saturday afternoons spent lost in the stacks, the name Borders will always be a reminder of a golden age of reading that we may never see again. Thank you for watching the rise and fall of an American empire. If you have memories of spending time in a Borders store, or if you still have a book on your shelf with that iconic white and red price tag, share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue to explore the vanished giants of the American landscape.